Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with Dr. Gnimbin A. Ouattara is a Fulbright Scholar from Côte d'Ivoire. He received his PhD in Atlantic Studies, U.S.-Africa, Europe Relations, in 2007 from Georgia State University, and also received a Master's in Film and Video 2010, specializing in historical documentary filmmaking from the same university. He is currently a professor of history and international studies at Brainerd University in Gainesville, Georgia. His work compares the Cherokee and West African civilizing processes within the context of the Western civilizing missions of the 19th century Atlantic. We will be discussing Portugal and the Curse of Cain, the birth of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, 1421 to 1441. So let's have a listen.
Thank you so much, Professor Ouattara, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, and to talk about Portugal and the Curse of Cain through the Transatlantic Slave Trade from 1421 to 1441. And I'm looking really forward to this conversation because, again, these are narratives that are not really told, but yet kind of implied, and definitely with the Portuguese connection, which, again, most people don't are fully aware or comprehend. Mostly it's just the British Atlantic slave trade that seems to be the dominant one. But before we start, I'll have you just do a brief introduction of yourself.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. I'll start by saying my name is Gnimbin Ouattara. So I'm originally from Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, in West Africa. My ethnic group is the Tabana. They are part of the, they're also called the Bambara. They're part of the Mandingo group. We are in the north of Ivory Coast. And I came to the United States in 2001 on a Fulbright Scholarship to study American democracy, because at that time, my country was going through trouble. I came in 2001, and in 2002, there was a civil war that erupted in my country. So this definitely showed me that I was right, to try to figure out what was going on. And sure enough, when I arrived, I realized the United States is a republic, not even a democracy, as my professor who was to direct my dissertation said. I could have just returned that day because my research was complete, But that's how I would say I like to introduce myself. I usually like to put my African part forward, and then the so-called credentials, that I received from Europeans, second, because that's chronologically how it happened.
Yes.
I was born, and then, early childhood, only started school at 6. My world comes first, not because of anything. Chronologically, that's how it happened. And I see the world of Europeans through the lens of my world. And I'm currently a professor of history and international studies at Brunel University.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor, for that. And, you know, mostly people mostly hear of course, Columbus, Christopher Columbus coming over in 1492. And of course, your paper, your article talks at a much earlier period. So would you be able to explain the significance of the period between 1421 and 1441 in the emergence of the transatlantic slave trade?
Yes. Um, I came to the topic of the transatlantic slave trade, um, you know, almost by accident.
Mhm.
And again, if you are in the north of Ivory Coast, um, you will only hear about slavery when you go to school. Like they there could very well have been slave raids all the way up to the north. I don't know. So far, there's a slave route project that they've created in collaboration with the UNESCO,
Oh,
but it shows in the south. Uh, there are stories in my village about people that disappeared. I've heard stories about young men that disappeared. There's never been any explanation other than they went to the field, and never returned. So I don't know if these stories are connected to slavery, but it piqued my curiosity um, when I arrived in the United States, and in my seminars, I heard professors, explaining. We read a book by um, another professor, John Thornton, and John Thornton's book, Africa and Africans in the Making of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, or something like that. Um, the Africa and Africans part being front and center in his book, which was supposed to be a response to, and he's a Caucasian historian,
mm,
was supposed to be a response to African American historians who were blaming Europeans, for the slave trade. So he basically came and said, no, they were the leaders of this uh, project. So, and here I am, an African, sitting in a classroom and with some African Americans. The course is taught by a Caucasian professor. Um, and I never had any historiography about slavery before because I did American studies, like an African literature, American literature in Africa. So I was shocked that Africans will be, front and center, will be the leaders of the slave trade, even by the professor's own research, because I speak Tabana,
mm,
then French, then English. The word leadership is is a concept, in my village, but the word leader in French and in English is the same. So I don't understand, or I don't misunderstand this word. I understand it fully. So when we read that book, I noticed that the Portuguese went to Africa and the slave trade started. And yet, the professor said Africans were front and center. Why? Because he claimed that Africans came and sold European Africans to Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
As a graduate student, I must admit I was like, why did I come here again? like I'm a graduate student, and here's a professor who teaches at a huge university like Boston University, and yeah, a scholar, and we're reading his book, and the word leader seems to be like the basic word that is misunderstood by him. I was like, that doesn't sound right, because Africans are in Africa and Europeans take their boats and arrive in Africa. Even if some Africans had come and sold other Africans to these Portuguese, they would still not be the leaders because they did not, if it, from my basic understanding of leadership, to lead something, like Africans would have had to take Africans and take boats and go knock at the doors of the Portuguese and say, do you want to buy somebody? We have people to sell to you.
Mm-hmm.
But to the extent that Europeans took their boats, Portuguese, and arrived in Africa, there's no way you could talk about an African being front and center. That was so elementary to me that you could talk about African participation, but to say they were the leaders of that. So I had to finish my PhD. So my professor said I picked some topics, and he's like, "Well, we paid for your scholarship. You got to select a topic that advances our history."
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so I was also interested in Christian missionaries, so I ended up writing a dissertation on Christian missionaries, to that period. And one of the Christian missionaries wrote about the curse of Ham. So he was from South Carolina, John Layton Wilson, and he was the first. It was among the first Christian missionaries in Liberia. You know, so I was like perplexed by that curse of Ham. I googled it. That time Google was the beginning. Um, so so it stayed in my mind. It's like an unfinished story. Here we are in the 1830s. We talk about someone who's talking about the curse of Ham, but he said something in his book that really opened this chapter that my article is on. He said Americans owed it to Africans, that is African Americans, to go help Africa because they picked up these Africans and brought them here as slaves, enslaved them. And so now it's about going and Christianizing and civilizing Africa. So he articulated this perspective that they owed it for having enslaved Africans' children. Europeans owed it to Africans to go civilize them. And I was like, wow. Okay, so I read somewhere that Africans, in my graduate school class, that Africans were the leaders of this transatlantic slave trade. I mean, if you're to be blamed for something, then nobody owes you anything. If you brought it on yourself, then nobody owed you anything. Why is this man now saying, and he was in the 19th century, basically his perspective predates the perspective of John Thorne, the professor. So I'm like, huh, okay. Then I finished my dissertation, and then I went and, started, becoming very interested in these things. And I wrote the article actually maybe a year after my dissertation. It was my first article that I wanted to publish.
Mhm.
I submitted it to the Journal of African History, and there were two reviewers, and it's the most elite, journal. There were two reviewers, and uh, they sent me the reviews. One loved it, and another one asked me to review some other Portuguese historians.
Mhm.
And then I went and read those Portuguese historians and realized there was no single African historian that had been reviewed. So I was like, okay, why are they asking me to review European, like Portuguese scholars who are basically already, to me, uh, writing patriotic, like, history. Like, they are there to extol the history of Portugal. Like, why should I be reviewing it? Why is the onus on me to review these people? We're not in the same lane, you know? Um, well, then even some colleagues say, well, that's scholarship. You need to review but you can't review everyone. You review
Yeah.
the people who are directly related to your research. Of course, I was a new graduate student, so I was kind of like full of myself. When you're a new graduate student, you think you made it. I'm like, no, I'm not reviewing this guy. Um, until they're like, okay, well, in that case, we can't publish it. I said, all right, fine. Um, then, time went on. I realized, oh, it was actually harder to publish. Once you were studying as a graduate student, you don't have anything out. That is major. I you know, had a book chapter, but other things, and that's when I actually discovered that the field of slavery was huge, that people had been writing on it for so long. And then I went in and started to do more research. And I read that book, I read the Portuguese historians and everything, and then fine-tuned, that article, and realized for me that African American historians, including Caribbean historians, were passing that episode. African American historians will quickly come to 1619.
Mhm.
You know, the Caribbean historians, you know, Eric Williams, who's kind of like the father of that, uh, capitalism, like the idea that like capitalism created racism, not the other way around. Like slavery is the result of basically people wanting to get money. It's not really like they were racist, you know. Um, I I just realized everyone was trying to explain something, As an African, that's not how we tell stories. So I noticed that Eric Williams, African Americans, I just realized a fundamental difference between myself and them. It's sad to say it that way, as a them, even though I consider them, we are the same, we're on the same boat. But the way Europeans tell stories, at least in history, is when you tell these stories, they don't necessarily go to the beginning, you know. Um, they could have themes, like topics, Um, but Africans, it's almost like, I don't know if you ever heard people say an African is too deep. Like when you're talking to people say, "Oh, this is too deep. You're going too far." You know.
Yeah.
But that's how Africans tell stories. They go to the origin. It's almost like, biblical origin of Genesis. And to the extent that there was Genesis, you know, the curse of Ham is in Genesis, and I'm like, why are people not? I don't see this. They talk about it in passing, but so I thank you, Google. I stumbled on the first chronicle of like in Google Books. So I found it, basically in some library, and then you know eventually it was placed in Google Books. Google just put the old books in there. So now I could, instead of traveling to these places, so I could read it at my house. That's when I went to the origin and realized that the Portuguese in the 1420s, there was no black, no white issue. It was just Portuguese over Portuguese.
Mm-hmm.
The Portuguese king, Prince Henry the Navigator, says, I want you, his subject. Like Europeans, I was shocked by that too. Like coming from my village, I'd never seen anybody who could, from any position, send people to death and say, go find me, go see if there are people there. That was amazing, that somebody's life, that the Portuguese prince had so much power on these people. He's like, go out and find me people to see if there are people beyond the Cape of Bojador. Like Cape Bojador is like narrow passing and stuff, beyond there, if there are people. Well, they get there after multiple trips, they come back, they're scared, and then they finally get there, and then one person sees people fishing, and they just come down and snatch. They chase them, according to them, they chase them down and manage to capture a man and a woman, and then take them to Portugal. As they were taking them to Portugal, they meet another group, and they said, well, our prince gave us a special mission saying we should go and capture. For you, it was to go and find, to see their people. But for us, it's like if we find people, we should capture some. All of that is surprising to me, that grown up people could be like sent like that by another grown up person. I'm like, what kind of world is that? It must be a world of suffering that somebody's life is put at. But anyway, that's how, when the first man they captured, when they claimed that that man was a king, that's when I knew they were lying. That's when I knew, and they called him Adahu, and they said he promised uh, uh, 3 to 5 people in exchange for himself, and the second group captured more people. I'm like, that's like, if you're telling this story to a kid, the kid will probably ask you a question like, how did they speak? How is he a king? He's out there fishing, with his friends, and you capture and you lie like that and say he's a king and he offered people, and then they returned him so he could show these people, and it's on them. They're telling this story, and the guy runs away, and then they end up going back and capturing more people, and they go to the Pope and ask the Pope, okay, what do we do with these people? We're finding them more and more. And the Pope says, yeah, the Bible says, they are descendants of Cain. Even the Pope, you know, misreads this passage, and they start blaming the Jews. And another professor, David Goldenberg, spends like almost 10 years trying to prove that it was not like slavery was not part of the Jews. The black enslavement did not start with the Jews. And I'm like, so after the Jews couldn't be blamed, now they come to the Africans and say, we sold our own people. And our best historians in Africa are busy with proving that Egypt was built by black people. you know, African American historians are busy proving that African African Americans' ancestors were kings and queens. And the Caribbean people are busy proving that it's capitalism that created slavery. you know so this story of how it actually started, nobody's interested in that. They like, no, it's just the Portuguese, and the Portuguese by that time are no, they've been displaced already. So it's a long explanation, but that's how I got to this episode as a neglected episode, and yet the episode where all of our dignity lies. That's how I look at it. If you want to, whatever story they've told you about Africans, the lie is there. That's where you know how it started. Forget about, like you said, they'll talk about the British, the British come later in that Portuguese world, 1619. Imagine they captured these two Africans, and then 10 others. 1441. If somebody is captured 1619, they're coming 200 years after that world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my point. My goal is for storytelling like that, like you and I, people of African descent, interested in how I want people to be interested in how this all started. Because and it's on black and white, the Google book is there, and other resources are there. You look at them, Africans were never at the beginning of this story. Yeah. So the professor, Africa and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World, John Thornton, in my book, he wouldn't, if I were the ones who were on the review board, of course his book would not be published. Right? And many other books would not be published because I would be like, no, this is contrary to the historiography. And yet these books are published, not only published, taught in graduate school in a clever way, because those students are going to go teach in those 4-year colleges and spew, because they didn't do any research of their own. They're just going to be quoting him, and the cycle continues. And then even Africans that come to the United States, they study this in passing, and then they go home and repeat that. So that's why it's important.
No, thank you so much for that, because again, it's almost as if perception is reality, even though it's, it's not.
Yeah.
And you said a number of things in here. I know that we're going to get into that, in terms of religion being used, and of course, just the fact of, your definition of leader and what that is, and who should be as perceived as the person or the group or the entity that actually started all of this, right? So I guess we need to now go into, of course, how did, the Curse of Cain narrative influence European justification for the enslavement of African people?
Yeah, so there are many white people, Europeans themselves, who written amply about the fabrication of the curse of Cain. Like the biblical curse, you know, according to which Africans are naturally cursed.
Mm.
Noah had three sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham. Ham supposedly saw his father naked after he'd been drunk on wine, and laughed. And here, uh, the two brothers took a blanket and walked backward and covered their father's nudity. In that Genesis 25, people can read the rest. Genesis 9, verse 25, people can read the rest. The biblical passage, even if we want to go to that, does not say where they were. When Noah gave the world to his three sons and said where they were would be for Shem, east of that will be for Japheth, and south of that will be for Ham, and punished Ham and said his descendants will be slaves to the descendants of Japheth and Shem. That's a European fabrication. First of all, there was no African in the biblical story. Like people could, even the Christian, my friends who are Christian, they're like, oh, the Bible was a. I'm not talking about the belief.
Mm-hmm.
God, as it is explained by the Bible. But how hard is it to understand that this is a Jewish story? This is the Jews came up with this story. I mean, what do I need to do to show in my village this story is not told? That's as simple as that. It's the Jews that created this monotheistic, explanation. They're the one that came up, even the flood. It's a Jewish story. Of course, there are some people who say they plagiarize. That's not my issue. It's a Jewish story. There was no African there, and they claim. So you are sitting in your village, somebody's cooking up a story somewhere, and then all of a sudden, somebody shows up at your doorstep and say you are descendants of slaves because your ancestor Ham laughed at Noah. Okay, that it's only later in the 19th century when Africans were able to read, that they saw this story. But from 1441, all the way to that 18th century, no African participated in that legitimation of the slave trade, that biblical explanation of the slave trade, that biblical legitimation saying you black Europeans, you are descendants of Shem, you can go. God allowed you in the Bible to go pick up the descendants of Ham in Africa. It's a made up story. It's made up from all angles. That's why they even made a mistake and call it Curse of Cain. Yeah, but the original story is Curse of Ham. So Africans are not descendants of slaves. We never saw any ancestor naked. Nobody ever laughed, you know? So this story is completely fabricated to justify the kidnapping, that's how it happened, of Africans. And so if you live in Europe and you are afraid that you are a minority, they won't let you go to the grocery store if you tell this story, or somebody is going to come shoot you, in the so-called freedom of expression world because you said this story was fabricated. I mean, I mean, you could drive and you hit by a car, or you could hit somebody, you could hit a tree. I'm a historian. I just saw that. It's fabricated. I wrote it down that it's fabricated.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I have. And everyone picked it up in Europe after the Portuguese went to Pope Martin and he fabricated it and then gave it to them, and they were using it to uh, uh, pick up Africans, like basically comfortably, no qualms, kidnapping people. Then when the Spanish, Columbus arrives, you know, in the New World, uh, they the ones Europeans explaining to us that Governor Ovando of that Spanish colony as early as 1502 had allowed Spanish people to bring Africans there, still under that legitimate enslavement.
Mm-hmm.
Then the French, then the British. So if you have an entire continent using a lie to enslave people, and now their scholars are going to come and say, "Oh, you started it," and then everybody's like, "Okay, yeah, it's a long time ago. All I need is to make money." They come here, Africans, to be engineers, to be doctors, but our community events are always in churches. When somebody passes away, we hold events in churches. When someone is married, the everything is in the church. When baby's born, every Sunday we're at church. How can that these people whose world, who's supposed to be educated and their world is based on the church? If you come and tell them the first lie and the origin of their suffering come from the church, it's like asking someone to flagellate themselves, or their world will crumble if they accept what I'm saying. Because it's like, I'm not saying even don't go to church. I'm just saying the lie, the suffering that binds you, started in the church. Now it's up to you to separate, to acknowledge that, yeah, it did start in the church, but I want to continue being Christian because that's how I think I could get to heaven. That's a different issue, going to heaven. You know what I mean? So my point is, yes, we should all understand that this fabrication of the curse of Cain, which is really what they meant was the curse of Ham, that fabrication, we had nothing to do with it. And that fabrication defines us today.
Yes.
To this day. Like you see how many white people know about this stuff? They don't. They go to churches. Now they're using symbolism, metaphors. They themselves are not, we know they came here as indentured servants and many other things. So, don't put them too high, thinking they know. They don't know. So, and then if I'm saying that, people, oh, are you arrogant? what is arrogant? I mean, they came as indentured servant. Did I make that up?
Yeah.
You know. So it's and people will say even say in the United States today, like 35% of people, maybe beyond uh a bachelor's. I don't know. They're numbers that are
Mhm.
amazing. Like the majority of people in the United States barely have a bachelor's degree. So they never got to study anything in depth, you know? Am I making that up? The stats are there, you know?
Yeah.
In Africa, it's even worse, you know? The majority of people in Africa is like, I don't even know if it is 1% that passed, but, went beyond a bachelor's degree of the population. And those people are the leaders of Africa. How much do they understand about this influence, in everything they're doing? That's why most of the time in Africa, if you want to be a quick president, you study business, you study money, or you're a banker, and people think, oh, he's a banker, or he worked at this bank or that bank. So, oh, as soon as he's president, the money is going to come to us, and it never does. And they start over. So, yes, my goal is to show people that that story influenced Europeans in extracting the millions of people that they brought here. And the Africans that went to European schools helped them bring more millions because they didn't know better. They were told this story, and many of them were actually walking around saying, yeah, we are cursed. We are cursed. I saw that in the Bible. We are cursed. I mean, that's like telling a kindergartner, uh, you know, classes start at 8. Okay, classes start at 8. The kindergartner, if he or she drops out of kindergarten, they're going to think classes start at 8 everywhere, every time. So you stay at the level of a kid if you only repeat things. But some classes that start in college, some classes start at 9:30, some classes start at 11, But you have to go to college to realize that classes can start anytime. But if you stay at the kindergarten level, yeah, for you, classes start at 8. So
Mhm.
the Africans that went to churches, because that's how missionaries civilized Africans, the men went to church to become church leaders. The women were in charge of raising the kids. And so that structure is still in Africa, today. So,
No, definitely. And and you mentioned again in your, I guess, in your first question answer is in regards to with Prince Henry. So just to, how in terms of how significant Prince Henry was in shaping Portugal's early expedition along the African coast.
yeah, so yeah, he was significant in the sense that he is the one by European feudal logic, and I explained that to Africans. It's like you have to be proud to be African because in 1420, here you have, like, even in my village in 2025, you could still go and look at the land. Like sometimes when I say that, people say, don't say that out loud, because Europeans are going to come and attack your village. I'm like, come on. But to this day, you could go in my village and identify a plot of land as long as no one else is on that. You could build your house or you could go farm on it. It's still there, 2025. But in 1420, in Europe, there was already a class of people who had been peasants in that feudal system, who were peasants, whose parents had been peasants for millennia, and who had nothing in life going on for them but to compete with each other to serve the king or the prince. If you are an African, you're not supposed to laugh at kings being 5 years old, like King Louis the 14th being 5, and all these other old people coming and bowing and being on their knees in front of him. A 5-year-old, like being a king of an entire country. And so Prince Henry was barely in his 20s when he was able to send all these people, like grown-ups. Some of them will run back and say, I'm scared. And it's like, straighten up your nerves and go see what's up there. And that is supposed to be so impressive, you know. Yes, he was influential, but in my eyes, like all Europeans, as an oppressor of his own people. But that's me looking at it from outside. But from their world, they had been in captivity for so long, you know, Europeans, that they were willing to die for a person, for their prince. He was not even the king, he was the prince. He sent these people, and Lord knows how many people died. They never, you know, we don't know their number, but many of them died. And he kept sending them, and more directly related to your questions, once they discovered and captured the first Africans and brought in some gold and everything, he started giving out licenses. So you come to him and you say, my Lord, I want to serve you. I want to get more gold for you and more people. And so tons of others went out and got licenses from him to explore. And they went and captured as many people as they could capture. They brought as much gold as they could get, and they may give him the fifth, or he made it like they spend all the money to bring different people together, you know. And that model of reward, exploration in a license in exchange for a reward, you know, like it started, you go out, you do his bidding, and he gives you a reward. So the license was a reward for going out to get his name great, you know. So you're working for him. He's now the navigator, you know. And there's even a book out by uh, uh, I think it's what is his name, uh, George Dimis or something, and the title is The Portuguese Pathfinder. So basically, we're supposed to be like, oh wow, Prince Henry found the path in the Atlantic, and so everyone else followed. Yes, he found a wicked path, and everyone followed. So Europeans, the Spanish, also followed the same model. They gave uh, Columbus a license, and he was supposed to, whatever he was going to find, they were going to make him the governor, you know, the viceroy. So basically, the vice king, basically the representative of the king, and he was going to reign over that area. And the British came, they copied the same model. You know, the Virginia company is the same model. I went to Canada. I found like the somebody in Canada, the Monseigneur or somebody,
Mm,
uh, uh, in Canada, it's the same story. You get the founders of Quebec, the founder of Montreal, the founder of this, the founder of that. They were all representing their king. So Prince Henry the Navigator indeed is the originator of this model whereby the king gives you a license in the Atlantic. I'm talking about the Atlantic.
yes.
Europeans can deal with how far back this system goes in their own oppression, whether it started from the Romans, whether it started from the Greeks, that's their problem. But as far as we are concerned in Africa, it started with Prince Henry the Navigator, who started this principle of giving people licenses to go capture Africans, and the Spanish followed, then the French, then the British, you know. So, uh, yeah, he's dead now. You
Mhm.
can't get any reparations from him, or any. I mean, people think it's a bad word. I'm like, it's not. It's not a bad word. Reparation is not a bad word. You just will never get it from any European because, I mean, they wanted you dead. Now you think they're gonna repair you for what? I mean, it doesn't make sense, you know.
It's another that's a whole nother episode to talk about,
Yeah, I know, right?
but I know what you mean in regards to having to have that justification, right? So how would you say, in terms of with this, with the Christian theology, the idea of Curse of Cain contribute to, I guess, the moral justification of slavery?
Yeah, it's morality. Morality is the driving force of humanity. Like, and there's you know, Europeans had philosophers, about morality, but they did not invent morality. So the idea of good and bad exists everywhere, irrespective of Europeans. Yeah. So what the Christian uh, ethics, the Christian morality, that is what Christian found to be good or bad, is amazing. And it fluctuates. What this is telling you, before I even give you an example, is if a Christian back then does something, decides to, let's say, eat with you today,
Mm-hmm.
that this is what is good, well, don't count on it tomorrow because they could move the goalposts. They were the deciders of what was good or bad. So today they could say it's good to eat with you. Tomorrow they could say it's good to kill you. For example, when the Virginia company uh, settled, in the Americas, and in 1619, people, there's that story that we look at about the first Africans that arrived here as indentured servants. The British were struggling with this question of having slaves in the Americas. So one British, not giving all the names so people could go check out my article, could read it, and there are other articles that are going to come out. But the British were struggling with the legal question. That is, for at that time, being legal was the same as being moral.
Mm. Okay.
So the British were struggling with the idea of having slaves. So the Lord Chief Justice over there in England said, no, at first, they're like, no, there's no slavery in common law. So slavery should, you know, if you come, uh, you know, basically people are bringing their slaves from America to England. People are looking at them, but legally, it was not until that Stewart case. There was a legal case where one slave had to run away, and they had to struggle with the question, and finally said, "Oh, well, there's no slavery in common law, but the Americans, the British who now live in America, from Virginia all the way to Barbados, that is in the British colonies, they have come up with this system whereby they trade Africans as merchandise." So there was a case called the Butts case. I don't need to get into the detail, but those original cases, that's when they decided that Africans were merchandise, could be treated as merchandise. So one day they said, in common law, an African cannot be enslaved. Another day they say, well, he's not Christian. So in Europe, in America, they have started to trade him as a merchandise. So this story went all the way to the 19th century, where they had a Dred Scott case in the United States in 1857, where a Supreme Court justice said, hey, Roger B. Taney, to be exact, that name, it's like, it's not my fault. I'm a Supreme Court justice. I'm only looking at the legality of things, about laws, to see something is constitutional or not constitutional. Mm. Black people have always been treated as merchandise, which is not true. There were times where in British law, they were not. But he cites conveniently the portion that works for him. So he says, they've been traded as merchandise, and all of our preachers have looked at them as such. So the Christian morality has always fluctuated. And that's the character of Christian morality in America that is important to understand. If today you're their friend, tomorrow you could be their enemy. Not just, it can happen in everybody's life, but the Christian morality's first characteristic is to always move the goalpost with regard to what is good and what is bad. And Black people were the first casualty before even Native American. Native Americans, they got their share when they came up with Justice John Marshall came up with the doctrine of discovery. After the Native Americans, again, they were not those. They got fooled as well. They thought, they were having it easier or something, until the issue around their land started to heat up. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, there's a doctrine of discovery. That is, all European kings had discovered this place as a no man's land, So that Christian morality of good versus bad is fundamental for us people African descent to understand, you know, that is they've always considered us cursed, and then they've always considered us as merchandise. They've all, even those in Africa, think they are exempt. They're not. Um, and then they've all considered as underdeveloped. So everyone at their own age has something, you know. Uh, Nowadays the new media, you know, um, we hear in the United States about TikTok. It's like, oh no, TikTok is collecting data on, Americans. It's not okay. But in Africa, you know, Facebook, WhatsApp, all of these people were collecting data, on Africans, as basically a pack of people that nobody could stand up for them because they don't understand what's going on. And that's okay if you could collect data on somebody if they don't understand, what's going on. And you could use it against them, and so on and so forth. So that's the Christian morality that is important for us to understand. Maybe one last point about that. That's how they justified also the two contraries. The first one was to bring Africans here as slaves. So the Curse of Ham says, or Cain, whatever, says they can enslave Africans, based on that curse of Noah, right? Now there are too many Africans in the New World. They're like, oops, we should return them to Africa. We shouldn't have taken them. It's like the two opposite. That oxymoron is amazing. The two contraries can perfectly live in that Christian morality. You could use it to bring them, and then when you don't need them, you could use it to return them.
Exactly. And then can be learned from examining Portugal's role in the birth of the Atlantic slave trade.
Yes. That's an excellent question. What lessons could be learned by us, by Africans, by Africans? What lessons could be learned is the first lesson that could be learned is the lies are like state. There's something called a state lie. There's a like state sanctioned lies. So the Portuguese, again, the fabrication of the curse of Cain or Ham, whichever one floats somebody's boat, was a state sanctioned lie. That's states lie. That's the before there was such thing as they started from these kind of lies, and then they moved to classified. Like when people, like when the state lies and they don't want their people to find out, they wait until everyone is dead, and then they classify. So those anyone interested in my research, it's not like I could have titled it "The Portuguese Lie," but no, I'm not interested in people thinking the Portuguese are liars. No. But I could also title my paper "The Fabrication of the Curse," but that's not the point. The point is for us to know how this story that involves you and I started. We don't want to prejudge. We just want to, follow the trail of the story. And I don't want people to, prejudge. When you read my article, you see I start from the beginning with no prejudgment, showing step one, step two, step three. First, he sent out this number, these other, So the first lesson is for us to realize that the lies that bind us, or that prevent us from seeing each other, even today, people who say, "Oh, Africans don't like you, African Americans. African Americans don't like Africans." And one person as great as Frederick Douglass, who was an African American thinker, when they were trying to bring Europeans, um, American, European whites were trying to transplant, or they call it colonize, American colonization society. They're trying to transplant like African Americans to back to Africa. They were lying to them, telling them, "Oh yeah, this you go to Africa, you get this gold, this." It was based on lies about what they could get. These are missionaries who'd never been there. How did they know you could go and get gold? They were just trying to get them to go. So they just fabricate anything as they've always done. And people, again, didn't willingly go because they already knew these, they've lied to them before. But some of them, took them at their word and said, okay, maybe it will make sense. The reason we know they thought they lied is when they arrived there, they ran away. You see, the portion in that lesson that we want to learn is that you can't trust any, and I'm weighing my word, you can't trust any official European story about yourself. And I'm not making it up. You have to start there. You don't have to be a nihilist. You have to know that they're more likely to lie about you than to tell the truth. So that's the number one lesson. If somebody is ever reading, anything about my work, is to know that, yeah, the lies are coming from the state, from the Portuguese state, from the Pope. In America, it was the American Colonization Society was based on a lie. And some people will say, "Oh, these are strong words." I'm like, you don't tell the truth, what's that called? It's a lie. Don't, okay, what would I say? Untruths or half truths? Whichever one you prefer, that's what you should go for. It definitely was not the truth. I might say this is the first big lesson. The second big lesson I would say is the hopefulness. Like we all have to be hopeful about our story, because even when Frederick Douglass said to people, we don't want to go back to Africa because the African kings don't like us. That's why they sold us. Even when Frederick Douglass was saying that, Frederick Douglass, you could look at that superficially and think Frederick Douglass bought into their lies, because it's not like he'd studied Africans and realized that Africans, didn't like African Americans. It's not. That's why you have to read more carefully when you're reading Africans or from the diaspora. He was saying that as a way to let them listen to what they wanted to listen to. That is, Europeans that's what they wanted to hear. His main goal was, please don't deport these people into a lie, because you're really taking them to die. They're moving them, all these people, to Liberia, really to die. So he was saying Africans don't like us anyway. Basically they're gonna kill us when we get there. But his choice of words, you can understand. He's recently freed. He's not gonna go up to them and be like, don't deport us, don't take the freed slaves and bring them back, because this is a lie. He's not gonna say that. So that's where I give him credit. Basically, it's like a strategy the same way Adahu may have told them, if he did, may have told them what they wanted to hear and said, take me back and I'll give you 3 in exchange. And then they took him back and he ran away. Frederick Douglass didn't want people to be sent to their death. And then he's like, no, but your place where you're sending us, Africans don't like us. You see that reading?
Yeah.
That's the second lesson. And once we do that, we will understand how you and I, and other people from the diaspora, how we should come up with our own language, almost like a code, so we can understand each other. And you know, like I could tell you something, and say, well, Jamaicans don't like Africans. Uh, that's why we should get together more often.
Mm-hmm.
My overall goal, if you get hung up on Jamaicans don't like Africans, yeah, you're still thinking like them. But maybe what I'm trying to say is, let's tell them what they want to hear, and then understand that the overall goal is for us to get together, you know. But again, people should listen to that. I didn't say Jamaicans don't like Africans, you know. So I'm just giving an example. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, understandable. Because during this time, I mean, I found with researching is that it's all different varying lengths of, you're peeling back an onion, right? And you're being able to find uncover based differently from what the main narrative had pushed there. So unless you're willing to cut the onion and to be able to peel back
Yeah,
everything, then you'll find the true story.
I like that.
And
Or peeling back, yes.
yes, exactly. So Professor Ouattara, as we come to a close, and this last question is, what would you say to those who argue that this history is too distant to be relevant today? What would you say to that?
Well, they're not African, like
Mm.
only an African. Yeah, that's why, like I'm saying, if you're African, and you will see everyone who's African, even those that are with us, like let's say of African descent, and they
Mhm.
tell you this history is too distant, what they are really saying is, I know this history is really close by, you know, but I just don't know how to get to it.
Mhm.
You know, they are alarming us and saying, it's I've never met a person of African descent who was not interested in history. We are all interested in history because it's in our DNA. We like origin stories. We because we are the originator. We are the origin. We're the beginners. So every single African has this origin story about how our people started, about how the earth is like that and the sky is over there, about when we were kids, as babies, 1, 2, we tell, I mean, a kid of 1 year old or 2 years old, why would people around fire be telling him stories about why the sky is so high that up there, and why he should be respecting his ancestors and stuff? So we go to the beginning. So somebody says this history is too far, you have to listen to the person in the second way.
Mm.
They are saying, I know this history is with me, but I just don't know how to get to it, or I don't know how to tell it,
Mm.
make it relevant. I don't know how to draw from it, because we tell stories in Africa to draw from them. You tell, like, Wangari Maathai. I don't know if you ever heard of her. She
Mm.
was the first woman And she's still the only woman, the only person to win a Nobel Peace Prize for the environment. But she used an African story and said, when the Africans said there are spirits in that tree, it's not real spirits in this tree. They're telling the kid not to cut the tree down because it's that tree that will filter the water. Is that tree? It's too long to explain that it will filter the water and do this and that. They just tell them there's spirits in there that will protect you. If you cut it down, you won't be protected. And in 1 second, they've persuaded the kid not to cut down the tree. And she studied in the United States and became a PhD in biology and tried to get people to plant trees and not cut trees using European biology explanation. It never worked. But when she went to the traditional story about the spirits in the trees, she was able to plant millions of trees, and reforest Kenya. And Europeans were so amazed. They that came and said there were no spirit in the trees, cut them down. Oh, making fun of the Africans. Look at me. I'm cutting down this tree to prove to you that there's no spirit. And after they did, the place was desert. They're the same people that were suffering with erosion, the one that settled in. And so when she went back to the African wisdom, she managed to bring back the forest in Kenya. So those people who tell you these stories are too far, they are really looking for a way to be inspired. They're like, inspire me. I know it's not too far, but just inspire me. Find me something where I can hang my hat on so I could become African again.
No, thank you. That's a great analogy to use. And I appreciate your time for coming on and discussing this because it's still being talked, right? And still being used. And so thank you.
You're welcome. It's my honor to be invited and to speak to you today. As they say in Africa, a kid doesn't know when their mother eats. So because the mother always serves them and waits for them to eat and takes the plate, and when they ask the kid in the street, what does your mom eat? They're like, what? Oh, my mom eats the wind. I've never seen her eat. She eats the wind. To say respecting mothers, the role that mothers or women play in our lives is like for you to be the first person to interview me about this article that so many people have read and everything tells me that African wisdom is still true. That is, it's through our moms that will feed ourselves and feed ideas to the world. So thank you for inviting me and nourishing my mind.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.